Morning. Welcome to today's meeting on Bill C-81, an act to ensure a barrier-free Canada. The objective of today's meeting is to continue the committee's thorough review of the bill. Bear with me, I have a bit of a preamble here, and my colleagues, I'm sure, are getting used to this. I would like to take a moment to remind both those participating in the proceedings as well as those observing the proceedings of the committee in person and on video that the committee adopted a motion on September 18th, which included instructions for the clerk to explore options to allow for the full participation of all witnesses and members of the public on this study. As a result, the committee has made arrangements to make all meetings in relation to the study of Bill C-81 as accessible as possible in a variety of ways. This includes providing sign language interpretation and near real-time closed captioning in the room. Please note that both American Sign Language and Quebec Sign Language are being offered to those in our audience. For those who would like to watch the American Sign Language interpretation, please sit in the benches to my left. For those who would like to watch the Quebec Sign Language interpretation, please sit in the benches to my right. In addition, please note that the first two rows of benches have been reserved for those who wish to avail themselves of these interpretation services. Screens displaying the near real-time closed captioning have also been set up, with the English to my left and the French text to my right. The sign language interpreters in the room are also being video recorded for the eventual broadcast of the meeting on Parleview via the committee's website. In light of these arrangements, the committee would ask that if you need to leave the room during the meeting, please do not walk in front of the sign language interpreters. Instead, please use the extremities of the room. In addition, we would ask that those in the room remain seated as much as possible during the meeting so that everyone in the audience can clearly see the sign language interpretation. Finally, if a member of the audience requires assistance at any time, please notify a member of the staff or the committee clerk. I will also just mention to our witnesses and of course to the members of the committee, due to the interpretation, please keep your comments at a steady pace. I have not been very heavy-handed with the stopwatch, so if you do go over a little bit, it's not the end of the world. If I get an indication that you are going too fast for the interpreters, I apologize in advance, but I will stop you to slow down a little bit. So our first panel this morning, starting from the Canadian Bankers Association, we have Marina Mandel, Assistant General Counsel, and Tasman Whaley, Senior Legal Counsel. And from Canadian Disability Policy Alliance, we have Marianne McColl, Professor, Queen's University. Welcome. And from the Royal Bank of Canada, Terry Monte, Vice President, Employment Relations. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being with us this morning. We're going to get started with our first opening remarks from the Canadian Bankers Association, Marina Mandel and Tasman Whaley. The next 5 minutes are all yours.
Great, thank you. Good morning. I would like to thank the committee for inviting the Canadian Bankers Association to provide our comments on Bill C-81, an act to ensure a barriers-free Canada. The CBA is the voice of more than 60 domestic and foreign banks and their 280,000 employees that help drive Canada's economic growth and prosperity. Canada's banking industry is pleased to support Bill C-81. The CBA was actively involved in the consultation process that led to this legislation, and we look forward to continuing to work with the government on the development of the regulations that will set the standards for accessibility in Canada. During debate in the House of Commons, Minister Qualtrough stated that this legislation, quote, is good for business and business knows that this is good for business, end quote. We agree. Canada's banks are leaders in providing accessible environments for their employees and customers. Banks are committed to treating all people in a way that allows them to maintain their dignity and independence. Banks believe in providing equitable opportunities through diverse and inclusive environments and are committed to meeting the needs of people with disabilities by preventing and removing barriers to accessibility. Banks have considerable experience with accessibility as it pertains to the workplace and employees. They offer individual solutions to employees with accommodation needs and have specialized departments to ensure that they continue to foster an accessible work environment. Banks have moved accessibility mandates forward through various approaches, including accessibility committees, policies, and strategies, all with the goal to work continuously towards amplifying the voice of employees with disabilities. Banks are also committed to ensuring accessible customer service. Most banks have groups with a dedicated accessibility mandate within their human resources and IT functions. Putting the needs of their clients first, banks continue to make enhancements so they can offer barrier-free facilities and services in their branches, offices, bank machines, online, and through mobile channels. Some examples of accessibility options provided by banks include teletype technology for telephone banking, video relay service, sign language interpreters upon request, Braille, large print, and audio for various customer materials, enhancements at branches such as door operators, ramps, and washroom upgrades, and accessibility features on computers and mobile devices such as color contrast and the ability to increase text size. We believe that any federal accessibility framework should strike the right balance between being principles-based and prescriptive. The framework should also recognize that accessibility and accommodation are often person-specific. In areas where there's frequent technological evolution, such as information technology, overly prescriptive standards could be problematic. In general, we support widely accepted standards that provide flexibility to institutions, customers, and employees in order to achieve the intended outcomes, and that provide adequate certainty as to what constitutes compliance. Further, because standards may change frequently, particularly as technology evolves, the framework should provide organizations with the option to comply with the standard mandated in the legislation or an equivalent or higher standard. Banks recognize that although significant progress has been made in making Canada more inclusive, people with disabilities still encounter barriers. The banks view accessibility as a journey and continually work to improve the inclusive design of their products and services. We're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. And from the Canadian Disability Policy Alliance, we have with us Mary Ann McColl, professor at Queen's University. Welcome.
Great. Thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to appear before this esteemed committee and to share a part of the research of the Canadian Disability Policy Alliance that I hope may be of use to you in your deliberations towards the passage of Bill C-81. I want to begin by commending the government on fulfilling its promise to Canadians with disabilities, on the timely pursuit of this legislation, and on the broad consultation undertaken. My name is Mary Ann McColl. I'm a professor in the School of Rehabilitation Science at Queen's University and Associate Director of the Centre for Health Services and Policy Research at Queen's. But I'm here today in my role as the academic lead of the Canadian Disability Policy Alliance. The Alliance is a national collaboration of disability scholars, advocates, and policymakers committed to understanding and enhancing disability policy in Canada. The CDPA is also a member of the Federal Accessibility Legislation Alliance, led by the Spinal Cord Injury Canada, from whom I believe you're hearing tomorrow. I understand that one of the objectives associated with the passage of Bill C-81 is the adoption of a disability lens, or a process that is reasonable, effective, and efficient for use by everyone in the public service to ensure that all government activities, including legislation, regulation, programs, and reports, are considered in light of their implications for people with disabilities. Such a lens would need to meet a number of criteria. It would need to be easily understood, presume no prior knowledge of disability. It would need to be written in plain language, be brief and efficient to use, comprehensive in terms of all types of disabilities and all types of policy, compatible with contemporary views and scholarship on disability, and evidence-based. I hope I'm not missing anything in those criteria. It sounds like a tall order, but I'm here today to represent a tool that was developed with exactly those criteria in mind, the CDPA's disability policy lens. The lens was first developed in 2006 based on an exhaustive review of the literature on disability policy analysis in preparation for a book, Disability and Social Policy in Canada, by myself and Lynn Youngblood. Since 2006, it has been used by many disability scholars and graduate students in Canada and internationally, and has been cited in numerous publications. In 2017, it was refined and pilot tested in collaboration with staff from the Office of Disability Issues and the Minister's Office. I believe you have the lens in front of you. Okay. The lens takes the reader through a series of 7 questions that go to the heart of contemporary disability policy analysis. However, it does not favor any particular ideology or stance. It merely asks the user to be explicit, to state their assumptions, and to examine them. Let's take a closer look at the questions. The first question: is the situation of people with disabilities explicitly mentioned in the policy? Have their interests and implications been overtly considered, or is it assumed that the implications for people with disabilities are the same as for anyone else? And is that a legitimate assumption? If disability is mentioned explicitly, how is it defined? Currently, a number of definitions are in force in the federal policy infrastructure. For example, definitions associated with the Canada Pension Plan, the Canada Student Loan Program, and the Disability Tax Credit as a couple of examples. Does the current definition conform with any of those? And does the policy focus on the right group of people? Who is left out? And who determines who is eligible to be considered? The third question asks what the policy tries to do for people with disability. There are typically 3 aims of disability policy, according to Bickenbach: access, ensuring the ability to participate; support, providing the necessary goods and services; and equity, ensuring freedom from discrimination. Although admittedly interrelated, there's usually a dominant goal that the policy addresses. If it's equity, what kind of equity is sought? Horizontal, vertical, or outcome equity? The fourth question of the disability policy lens looks at the contemporary view of disability. We no longer look at disability as something that is wrong with a person. That would have been the biomedical definition. Instead, we consider someone with a disability as someone who is prevented from having the life that they seek because of barriers encountered in a society not designed with them in mind. Question 4 addresses the view of disability espoused by a policy. Are people with disabilities considered a minority group with special interests, special needs, or are they simply considered citizens entitled to the same rights and privileges and responsibilities as other citizens? Although it may sound like the answer should always be the latter, there are many situations where disabled people need to be singled out for special consideration, accommodations, benefits, or programs. The fifth question: how does this policy relate to policies, other policies within the jurisdiction or in other jurisdictions? Is something being given with one hand and taken away with the other? Is the policy objective either duplicated or undermined by policy elsewhere? The sixth question: who are the other stakeholders whose interests need to be considered alongside people with disabilities? I don't need to tell you about this. Balancing the competing needs and desires of multiple stakeholders is what you do every day. But I have listed a few examples of other groups whose needs need to be considered, such as other minority groups or business and the private sector. Finally, who are the advocates or proponents of the policy, and who are its detractors or opponents? Where might we expect to encounter support or opposition? What might be the fallout of that opposition, and how can it be countered? I hope you will agree that these 7 questions that make up the CDPA's disability policy lens represent a process that meets the criteria set out at the outset. Brief, evidence-based, versatile, easy to understand and administer, and compatible with contemporary disability studies. Thank you for your attention and interest in our work, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. And finally, from Royal Bank of Canada, Terry Monty, Vice President, Employee Relations. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning. My name is Terry Monty, and I'm the Vice President, Employee Relations at RBC. I have global responsibility for workplace policies and programs, leading a team of expert advisors who help employees and managers deal with workplace issues. We're a global financial institution with a purpose-driven and principles-led approach to delivering leading performance. Our success comes from our 81,000 plus employees who bring our vision, our values, and our strategy to life so we can help our clients thrive and our communities prosper. In 2017, we had 45,600 employees working in RBC's federally regulated businesses. 7.4% of those employees identify as having a long-term or recurring physical, mental, sensory, psychiatric, or learning disability. Only 4% consider themselves disadvantaged in employment because of their disability. Our approach to accessibility has evolved over many years, and our vision has grown beyond the initial steps taken a few years ago. Today, accessibility is embedded in our diversity and inclusion blueprint for 2020, which sets out our vision to be among the most inclusive, successful companies, putting diversity into action to help employees, clients, and communities thrive. At RBC, employee and client accessibility practices are governed by our enterprise accessibility guidelines, which are consistent with the principles of dignity, independence, integration, and equal opportunity, and outline our expectations with respect to accessibility practices globally. The guidelines also require employees to comply with the accessibility laws and requirements applicable in the specific jurisdictions where they operate. Some lines of business and functional groups have also implemented local accessibility policies and best practices. One example would be our technology and operations business, which has its own IT accessibility guidelines. These guidelines are based on international standards for web accessibility and provide guidance in deploying technology solutions that are more accessible to those with blindness, low vision, color blindness, mobility disabilities, deafness, and hearing loss. We know we have work to do, but we also have some great initiatives to profile, and I'd like to give some examples. Within the built environment, every new RBC branch we open is wheelchair accessible and built in accordance with applicable building codes. Our physical locations are audited periodically by internal groups as well as external regulatory agencies to identify and remove barriers. In fact, we were excited to learn that the Rick Hansen Foundation, who we've begun working with to review the accessibility of our premises, will be an assessor working directly with the Minister of Public Services and Procurement and Accessibility. Within employment, through Pursue Your Potential recruitment program, candidates get dedicated support during the job application process, which includes resume writing and interview coaching, and as well they're proactively profiled to recruiters and hiring managers. We're really excited about our partnership with Specially Stern Canada to hire employees with autism, a non-visible disability. They remain engaged throughout the entire process, including selection, hiring, onboarding, and training. Within information and communications technologies today, our telephone representatives can assist with a variety of financial solutions, or clients can do their own transactions via interactive voice response, teletypewriter, or video relay services. Our network of over 4,600 banking machines is the largest in Canada. We were the first bank worldwide to provide talking ATMs, which is now adopted by standards organizations around the world. Today, all RBC branch banking machines are voice guidance enabled. Within the procurement of goods and services, we are proud to be the first founding member of the Inclusive Workplace and Supply Council of Canada, which works to ensure that procurement opportunities go to businesses that are owned and operated by veterans or persons with disabilities. Within delivery of programs and services, in conjunction with the CNIB, we're excited to roll out Blind Square, the leading navigation app for blind and partially sighted people that acts as a verbal GPS when navigating the city. We will soon be able to provide verbal wayfinding inside our branches. In 2017, we received acknowledgements of our work, including ranking as one of Canada's best diversity employers by MediaCorp, and receiving the Spinal Cord Injury Ontario Employer of the Year Award and the Employment Equity Achievement Award from the federal government. We know there are still barriers for people with disabilities that can detract from our collective ability to create truly diverse and inclusive workplaces and communities. This is very much a journey, and we continue to work hard every day to improve. We support legislation that seeks to make Canada more inclusive, and we are committed to respecting the legislation and regulations once adopted. Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you very much to all of you. We're going to get started first round with MP Barlow for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for taking some time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. It's certainly much appreciated to get your perspective on where this legislation is going. But certainly it sounds like a lot of work has already been done from listening to Ms. Monty and some of the work that RBC is already doing in your branches, which is great news. But one of the concerns that we have with the legislation is that it doesn't include any standards or any timelines to achieve some of those standards. And to me, it sounds like there was probably some very good practical examples already in the private sector, as you were outlining. So maybe you can give me some examples, or is this a concern or something we should be worried about, or should the legislation have some definitive timelines on when there should be compliance from your members or from RBC? In terms of just some clarity on what your path forward should be.
So, I think, as I think you've alluded to, and I hope the remarks that I made and Ms. Monty made illustrate, the banks have been doing a lot of this already in the absence of legislation, with the introduction of the AODA in Ontario and Manitoba, Nova Scotia having their own legislation, that has spurred more activity. So we're ready to act quickly. From our perspective, this is something that the banking industry was doing prior to C81 and will continue to evolve and progress. So, concerns have been expressed about timelines. We're not opposed to timelines, but we recognize that the minister went through a very robust consultation that we were actively involved in, involving so many stakeholders, and we support the notion of a framework legislation that allows regulations to evolve over time, standards to evolve over time, as best practices evolve, as technology evolves. And the other aspect of that is, of course, CASDO will have people on its board, in persons with disabilities, that can inform the process. And a lot of stakeholders have now been engaged in the process that can communicate their lived experience in a way that informs the standard. So we support the framework legislation. We look forward to consulting with the government on standards, and we really do think the end product, will be much closer to achieving the intended outcomes of the legislation.
Monty, did you want to add?
I would agree with what Ms. Bendel has said. This is very big work, and it's important to do it right. It's important to consult, and it's important to listen to all of the stakeholders that are involved. I think looking at the policy lens that Ms. McCall referred to, you really do need to engage those stakeholders and spend the time to develop something that will work going forward.
Now, one of the other issues with the legislation is that there seems to be a two-tiered system as I read through it, whereas there is a very large number of exemptions for government departments, but federally regulated private sector organizations do not have access to those exemptions. There are fines in place for federally regulated businesses who don't meet the standards when they are outlined. There are no fines against government departments. I would assume that if we want to do this right, as you're saying, Ms. Monty, that everybody should be treated the same, that the government departments should have to achieve these standards just as a federally regulated private sector group should. I think if we want to send the right message to Canadians with disabilities, that everyone is treated equally, that there shouldn't be exemptions and relief for government departments that federally regulated private sector businesses do not have. I would just ask all three groups if you could maybe give me your opinion on that. Should that be something that we should be looking at, that there should be an even playing field across all government departments and federally regulated groups.
Looking at me, I'll speak.
No pressure.
I mean, obviously, yes, you would expect the same standard to be applied across the board. What the mechanism is for ensuring that that standard is met may be different within government than outside of government. But I think the principle that you're stating, that you would expect the standard to be met across the board, is certainly sensible.
I'm happy to add on to that. Pretty much aligned. I think it's really wanting to focus on the intended outcome, and the government of Canada has displayed a lot of commitment to that outcome in introducing this legislation. So I think the distinction between the mechanisms and the path versus the outcome that Ms. McCall pointed out is what makes sense to me. So yes, a level playing field from an outcomes-based perspective, but there might be different ways of getting there.
And I don't have anything to add. I agree with both.
I appreciate that. Well, and I would agree with your comments, but in my opinion, it would be difficult to reach the same outcome if you have one that has some legislation that forces them to get to that outcome, and one doesn't. One can apply for an exemption and doesn't have to reach that outcome at all, whereas your members would have legislation that ensures that you meet those standards where government departments would not. And there's also an appeal process for government departments that isn't there for federally regulated associations. So I think that is something that we need to address in this legislation. So that's just something I wanted to bring to your attention. And I just have one quick question left. And Marianne, just you were talking about in your disability lens, we had one of the officials from the government say that anybody who can self-identify as someone with a disability would be considered. And I just wanted your clarification. What would that entail, someone who self-identifies as someone with a disability? I haven't heard that term before.
Basically, someone who responds affirmatively to the question, do you have a disability? By definition, is someone who self-identifies. Defining disability is a thorny issue, and the government has addressed it in a number of places throughout the federal policy infrastructure. It would be tempting to think that there is one definition that we could apply across the board, but in fact, given that different pieces of policy have different intentions and are intended to address different sectors of the population, it's something that needs to be looked at very carefully. Self-identification is a good start, but there needs to be a bit more thought than someone just coming forward and saying, I have a disability, and so I want to be considered for a particular program or a particular entitlement.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And next up, we have MP Long, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses this morning. Continue to give them education every time somebody presents. A lady in a wheelchair a couple weeks ago said to me, "You're opening up my world with C81." And I kind of stopped, and we had a great conversation, and I walked away from that. And she's right. C81 is opening up the world with people with disabilities, and it hits home to me in my riding of St. John Rothsay. Key Industries is an organization that deals with a lot of people with disabilities, and we recently announced some funding there, some EAF funding, so they could have more accessible washrooms, just small, simple things like that. And, I view transforming our businesses, and, you look at challenges, whether it's getting on a plane in St. John or catching a train or mailing mail, the absolute challenges and barriers that people have with disabilities. And, I view the change as an investment. It's not a cost. And, sometimes I worry, and not only my conservative colleagues, but, other businesses I talk to also say, I would do that, but there's such a cost. And, I look at it as more an investment. So I'll start with maybe you, Professor McCall. Can you just speak to that? Like, in your opinion, is taking action to invest in enhancing accessibility more of an investment than a non-recuperable cost. Can you just talk to that?
Yes, and I'll begin my remarks by saying most people who have actually made the amendments necessary to make their premises accessible or their processes accessible are surprised by how small the costs are. The costs often sit in people's mind as a huge impediment to moving forward with accessibility measures. And in fact, our research has shown over and over again, people are surprised by how little the cost.
I'll just jump in. Somebody mentioned, and I apologize, I forget what witness it was, but mentioned it was like $500 per person or something like that. It really wasn't that significant.
I have not heard a number like that, but that's very interesting. I'd love to know more about that. The bottom line is if we plan these things from the outset, if we design processes and structures to accommodate everyone from the outset, the costs are minimal. If we have to retrofit, they're more significant. So what that says to me is that the route that we're going of having legislation that says let's make this an expectation, let's make this a part of our culture, to think about people with disabilities and to ensure that the needs of people with disabilities are considered in everything we do, is the way to go and is the way to be cost efficient with it as well.
For sure, somebody like Mark Wafer at Tim Hortons, I mean, led the way, showing that, again, it was an investment, and he came back with, a higher productivity, lower absenteeism, all those things. Thank you. Ms. Monty, do you have anything to say to the investment versus cost?
We would absolutely agree that it's an investment. It's an investment in our people, in our clients, and in the communities we support. It is good for the people. It is good for the communities, and it is good for business as well. In terms of the actual cost, I would agree with Professor McCall. It is surprisingly not as expensive as many people would think on average to accommodate people. And that's because a lot of accommodation costs nothing in terms of hard costs. It's a schedule adjustment. It's putting somebody's workstation near a window rather than in the middle of the room. It can be a variety of things like that that are easily achieved without much cost.
Can you just touch on a couple investments that Royal Bank has made across the country for people with disabilities?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there are the voice-guided ATM machines that are in all of our branches.
Across the country?
Right across the country in every branch.
Okay.
All of our ATMs are voice-enabled. We have at least one wheelchair-accessible ATM in each branch as well. And over the next 3 years, we plan to have all of our branch ATMs wheelchair-accessible as well as audio-enabled.
What would happen in the event that a branch simply couldn't adhere to that wheelchair-accessible ATM?
We don't anticipate that being an issue. It's part of our plan going forward in terms of ongoing branch renovations and new branch construction.
Okay. Ms. Mandel?
I think the only thing I'll add is on behalf of the association with 64 member banks is there's a lot of competition for talent, and there's competition for customers. I think we all know this. That's the banking industry is competing. So it's absolutely 100% an investment in the employees. When you want to attract people, you want to have them stay, you want to promote them through the ranks, you want to accommodate them. So it's an investment in our talent pool, and then customer service is at the core of what banks do. And why would we not want to accommodate to ensure that more customers can access products and services?
Have you come up with any resistance at all? And what changes have you seen over the last 5 years?
Resistance in the sense of to the legislation itself.
Yes.
So we haven't had any resistance to the legislation. And I think the language around accessibility, and Ms. Monty referred to this in her opening remarks, it's part of the broader discussion and conversation about diversity and inclusion. So there isn't resistance to the intended outcomes. I mean, there's always things that we think about. So, I indicated in my opening remarks, we're thinking about the balance between principles and prescription. We think about flexibility. We think about, especially for our large cross-border members, how other jurisdictions in the world evolve, particularly, let's say, on information communication technology, and how we can create standards that do not compel the Canadian bank to be completely at odds with what RBC's UK subsidiary is required to do.
Thank you very much.
Those are the kinds of things we think about, but there has been no resistance to the desired outcomes.
Thank you very much. MP Hardcastle, please, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. I'm hoping that we can get some more feedback from you with regards to how we can make C81 effective in using that disability lens. Other jurisdictions, other countries have done this. This bill should be our first attempt at complying with the UN Convention. So there's a lot of definitions out there. There are best practices being used, and it is evolving all the time. A lot of the work that has been done does focus on seeing disability as one of the variables of the population, so that we're ensuring, this act is ensuring more coverage, more access. We're just broadening that cookie cutter, if you will, and saying that this is a part of the population we have to start fitting in. One of my colleagues just mentioned in his question the fact that was provided to us. It was the Public Service Alliance of Canada. They've done a lot of work. A lot of groundwork has been done just because of the Employment Equity Act. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that in your roles right now, having to roll out the Employment Equity Act. There's a lot of synergy. There is a lot of opportunity here for us to leverage that. I would like to hear you expand on that if you could. And my time is brief. I'll just let you take from that preamble just your thoughts on how we can be leveraging existing legislation such as the Employment Equity Act.
So I'm happy to start. So, you know, there's a certain element of, obviously, on the employment front, duplication. I think from sort of a first principles perspective, the accessibility C81 it's much more foundational legislation that obviously covers a lot more. The Employment Equity Act, obviously, as you know, focuses just on the employment side. That said, I think a lot of what has been done by federal employers under the EEA can be leveraged, and I'll look to Ms. Monty to expand on that, but can be leveraged to meet some of the requirements that we will see in the employment standard under the C81.
And just to add on to that a bit, inclusion is the real goal. Inclusion is one of our values, one of our core values, and that's the goal that we're working towards. The Employment Equity Act processes and reporting procedures help us get to that goal. This accessibility legislation will help us as well. They're both channels, they're both ways forward that help us take that really holistic view of accessibility within RBC, which has multiple dimensions, and to take that holistic view and help us go forward with this work.
I think one of the strengths of this legislation is that it is structural in its approach rather than individualistic. I referred before to three objectives of policy: equity, access, and support. Whereas the Employment Equity Act is about equity, about ensuring freedom from discrimination, this one is more about ensuring access and looking at the responsibilities of individuals and organizations towards people with disabilities, and to ensure an equitable and inclusive environment rather than affording people with disabilities redress against discrimination. So it's a different way of approaching the same issue. And of course, the two ideas of equity and access are related. But I was delighted to see that this was, this legislation was taking an access approach rather than simply another layer of anti-discrimination protections, which we're well furnished with in Canada.
Mr. Chair, I have another minute.
30 seconds.
Okay. And what do you think of us having this new standards organization, especially we've discussed here? What do you think of having that comprised of with a majority? Sometimes majority is one more than half. To comprise the board, we were hearing some testimony talking about 70% should be comprised of people living with different abilities. And I just would like to hear maybe your experience and how you gather your input, if you have some ideas for us where you think that approach should go.
So we're aware that other witnesses have talked about specific numbers. I mean, I would say a couple of things. I think having that this unique entity that has just at the beginning the requirement of 50% plus has been really great. We don't have a specific number in mind. The provision, as you know, also requires the CASDO's board to reflect the diversity of Canada overall. So I'm optimistic that once it's put into place and we see how the dynamic between individuals on the board work, it might evolve to a higher number. But I would say it's a very positive development in the first instance to have the CASDO board, unlike other boards, obviously, that have a role in this, like CHRC, having that board be informed by persons with disabilities.
Thank you very much. And now over to MP Rumi, please, 6 minutes.
Oh, thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. As my colleague, Mr. Long, had said, every day is a new day of education, and we keep learning more and more. I want to stick with timelines. We're hearing a lot about timelines, and when I think of timelines, you know, it's by this date, this has to be done. But all the testimony I keep hearing, there's an evolution. We haven't told you to do things, but you know, the banks, the airplane transportation agency, they're all saying the same thing. It's an evolution to get to where we need to go because there's so many different pieces. And when we look at the disability policy lens, I can see that. I can see why, because it's not one thing that says, okay, we're there now. We've done it. Yay. We've done our job. It doesn't work that way. So I'd like to get, because at the end of this, we have to come up with potential recommendations for amendments and so on and so forth. And I know this one's going to play prominently. So I'd like to get more feedback on your thoughts of why we should or should not, as we're proposing, have hardcore timelines on there and why. We can start with Ms. Mandel.
Sure. So, I mean, I touched on this earlier, but I'll go a bit more into depth. So for us, it is a very complex piece already, what the framework legislation sets out. So you have the infrastructure, you have to create CASDO, appoint the commissioner, appoint the officer. You've got the standards development, which we have heard from many other witnesses, including us today. You've heard you know, it needs to be finely tuned. It needs to be informed by experiences in other jurisdiction. It needs to be informed by stakeholders. And on the stakeholder point, the Minister Qualtrough, I believe, said just in the last 2 years, she's received feedback from 6,000 individuals and organizations. I mean, and as we get into the details of the standards, we would expect to see more of that, and other views being at the table. And one of the points we have made to the government and other stakeholders have made is the desire to see harmonization within Canada, so with the provinces that already have legislation, and as I indicated earlier, for our cross-border banks, you know, a desire to see on at least ICT harmonization. So all of that takes a lot of time, and you know, there's no endpoint where Canada's 100% barrier-free. That's a dream, but as best practices and technology evolves, I think it'll keep moving in that direction. Ms. Whaley, do you want to just add on the progressive realization?
Sure, yeah. So one thing that is mentioned throughout the Act is the idea of progressive realization, this idea that accessibility is dynamic and it's constantly evolving, and there will never be a date by which, you know, we're finished with accessibility. And that's the view that our banks take, is that this is an evolving process, and we always want to be, you know, aware of best practices and always innovating in terms of providing accessible options.
Excellent. Anybody else want to add into that?
Well, I would echo Ms. Mandel's comments about the need for harmonization and to make sure that the Canadian public, our employees and our clients, have a consistent experience no matter which RBC door they come through, whether it's a provincially regulated subsidiary or the federally regulated bank. That's very important to us, and it's important to take the time as we go through this to make sure that experience remains consistent. And this is very much a journey, as both Ms. Whaley and Ms. Mandel mentioned. The world evolves and things change. The goal that you're working towards today might shift a little bit with some new innovative technology that makes more things possible. So it's important to have the flexibility to move forward in a way that takes that harmonized approach and also takes advantage of innovation as it happens.
Did you want to add something?
I'd like to roll into my response, a response both to the question about the composition of the standards development body and the timelines. There are a lot of stakeholders involved here, and there's the opportunity to do this quickly or to do this well or somewhere in the middle. And we're obviously balancing off those two things, and it's complicated by the number of different stakeholders. So I refer you back to question number 6 on the policy lens that says, be sure to give everybody who needs to have a voice if they are going to play a part in implementation. Because as we know, if people don't have their say at the outset, they dig their heels in and create opposition. And so I think the number, I know it's important to some disability groups, but to me the issue is more have the right people had a voice so that they don't end up just being opponents to whatever happens, and they have to buy into the process at some point. So.
Thank you. I have just about 30 seconds left. Would you say that actually putting in timelines, legislating timelines, would that actually be a downfall? Because would it limit people to, we only have to do this, so we're not going to do any more because that's what the law says? Would you agree that that would actually be detrimental to this process?
I think it could be, absolutely, conceptually. There is the low-hanging fruit, and perhaps, maybe more so for the industry I represent and some of the other industries you've heard from. And I'm cognizant, the minister did talk about the mom-and-pop trucking companies, right? So it's, I think depends on the timeline is kind of the answer. But I think there could be a negative impact insofar as people say, okay, I've got X amount of time to do this, and then I'm done, right?
Thank you very much. And MP Hogue for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. We've been, I think this is our 4th session and maybe 12 to 15 witnesses. And not surprisingly, everybody who comes before us see this as a positive venture. The bill has a lot of positive notions to it. They reflect the values and the principles inherent in it, and it's about some of the details. But obviously the people who are coming are those people who are in favor of it. So being an adherent of John Stuart Mill's notion of being able to understand the other side in order to be able to make an informed decision, and the other side has not come before us, and yet people keep making references to it. I wonder if each of you could take a couple of minutes and tell me what the other side would say, the people who are saying this is wrong, because we're going to have to face some of those, no doubt, and some of them are out there. Professor McCall, what are the questions or the other side of this, or the edges of this that we would hear from those people who are not in favor?
I think that one of the other sides may be people with disabilities who think that it's not enough, that want the legislation to go farther and faster and more far-reaching. I think that's perhaps one of the most delicate sources of opposition to be addressed. And I suspect you've already heard from some of them, but yeah.
Others?
I think one thing you might hear from opponents is the cost. I think we've talked a little bit about that versus making an investment. And that might be a concern for smaller organizations who aren't quite as far down the path as we are. And so you might hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add. Those would have been the two that I would have pinpointed.
Certainly, we've heard from a lot of large organizations, national organizations, large businesses, and some of the references have been made. In fact, the witness yesterday from YVR, from Vancouver Airport, was saying they had concerns about some of the smaller organizations and their ability to finance some of the changes that were associated with it. And so that's certainly been an issue. And it's about the timing and the standards as MP Rumi just made reference to. So I think that contextually, those are some of the things that we have to look at and manage and deal with. There's been a lot of discussion as well in terms of the policy development, ensuring that we have people who are informed with their own disabilities to inform the development of the policy. My experience in terms of policy is that that's obviously a positive thing to do, but sometimes it seems to me that after the policy or legislation is developed and it then goes to a bureaucracy, a government to implement, that there's some things get lost between the policy development and the implementation stages. Can you talk a little bit about how we might be able to ensure that that is contained within the implementation process, that we have access to those people who have informed the policy, ensuring that there's not a disconnect between the policy and its actual implementation, which I've seen happen a number of times? Are there some safeguards, some experiences you have that would be helpful in terms of informing that?
I think the Standards Development Organization is a good safeguard against the intention getting lost, and a very direct way of implementing the policy. Of course, what happens in the public services is opaque to many of us. Probably you're more familiar with it than we are, but I must admit I felt that the Standards Development Organization was a good assurance that the intent of the legislation would be upheld.
I would add to that, as you know, C81 sets out for the accessibility plans, the feedback and the progress report, the duty to consult with persons with disabilities. And I think that's another safeguard that ensures that the people most impacted by the legislation stay involved on an ongoing basis as it's implemented by the private sector.
Can you talk about other jurisdictions that we might learn more from? How does Canada, where it sits today, compare with other jurisdictions? Where are the very best practices? What are the pieces that we might learn from in terms of those jurisdictions which are doing this more effectively or perhaps than we are in certain areas?
Our natural comparators are, the UK, the US, Australia, New Zealand, those kinds of countries. And of course, they've all gone the anti-discrimination route with their federal legislation. And I'm very pleased that Canada didn't go that route, but rather went an access and inclusion route. Ontario is the one jurisdiction that stands out as having tackled the problem of society-wide standards. I think there are lessons to be learned from Ontario's experience.
I think Ms. Whaley and I are not all that familiar with experiences outside of Canada, though I take the point that Professor McCall just made. I would say in Ontario, one of the things that has been great and been translated into the C81 context is that notion of framework legislation with standards to follow, with separate consultations on each standard. So I think that's been a good role model in Ontario to look at.
And I would also agree that Canada has been a leader in this area. I do manage a global team. I have a team in the U.S. that does accommodations and a team in Canada that does accommodations. There's a huge difference between the legal requirements and what is actually done. So I think that from that perspective, from the individual perspective, we have gone considerably further than our colleagues in other parts of the world. And I would again say that the AODA is probably a good example of existing legislation and process.
You're saying we've gone.
Sorry, Gordy, I gotta cut you off there. Sorry. We got to get one more question in from MP Diot. Thank you.
Yeah, this is to the banking representatives. Thanks for outlining some of the good stuff you've done. It looks like there's been significant progress. But, I mean, I'm lucky enough to be an able-bodied person, and yet I frequently have accessibility problems when trying to get through to a local branch, trying to get through to a live person, trying to navigate websites to find features that are on websites that are overly complicated. So how much more difficult is that for people with disabilities?
I can start off. We said in our opening remarks that we do see this as a journey, right? And I think other stakeholders, not just the banking community or the private sector, see it as a journey. So there is a huge amount of innovation in the banking space, as in many other industries, and that can often mean we're not communicating. The communication out to customers, clients might not always come perfectly in sync with the evolution of the products and services. But I can tell you, going back to my point a little while earlier, customer service is the core of our business. The banks don't exist without customers, period. So to the extent persons with disabilities or able-bodied are challenged in finding information at a branch, on a website, banks are there to help, I'd say.
We do train people in customer service. We do try to make our websites and all of our information as accessible to everybody as possible. We are on a journey. We have said that, and this is very much a journey. We are looking for opportunities to improve. Absolutely. This legislation will give us a more harmonized view and the opportunity to get feedback as we go through this process to help us get there.
One of the things that helped me recently with, I think it was a problem with Shaw, is a feature of live chat, because you get frustrated, you can't reach anybody, you're on hold. Are banks going that route? Do they have that now? And is it accessible for people with disabilities as well?
We do. We have a number of channels that people can use to reach out to us, including live chat on our websites. These are accessible through multiple formats.
And also, do you have any ideas regarding amendments that could be used for this bill? Anybody on this panel?
We don't have amendments in mind for C81. Some of the considerations we put forward to the government as we engaged over the last 2 years actually would end up relating more to, I think, the standards. So whether it's principles, a balance between principles-based approach and prescriptive, whether it's harmonization across, harmonization with the provincial jurisdictions that have accessibility legislation. Our concerns or considerations have been more in that direction, but not to the text of the bill itself.
And I think both the banking representatives talked about a lot of progress has been made, but there are still barriers for people with disabilities. Can either of you give me some examples of the barriers that still exist?
I think one we can point out, and it's again it's a point about how innovation happens and how there might be a bit of a gap or a lag time. So touch screens, a lot of people are banking on mobile now, and those touch screens might not be accessible to everybody. Although there's a lot that the banks have done and our vendor partners have done to bring it forward to make it more accessible. But that's an example I would use.
And Ms. Monti, do you have any examples?
There are individual situations because each individual obviously presents different capabilities and different disabilities. So we do find occasionally individual issues with the location, with parking, things like that can act as barriers.
Still on that note, obviously banks are going to a model where they're taking away the neighborhood locations and going to farther satellite locations and merging 3 or 4 branches into one. How does that impact somebody with a disability?
So, the question, branch closures, they're always happening in consultation with the community. So it's definitely not an easy decision. Part of that consultation in determining whether to have a physical location involves consultation with all the impacted customers. So there are other alternative ways to deliver products and services, whether it's online, mobile, people, so mobile financial planners or mortgage advisors that can be made available to customers. Again, I keep going back to the first principle of banks don't want to lose customers. They're waging a war for customers. So these decisions they're made with a lot of thought and consideration. And obviously part of that is how to retain customers and ensure that they continue to be serviced regardless of the manner in which they're serviced.
Do you think that you'll be going more and more to a model of bankers coming to us, to able-bodied and disabled people? I know that in larger business deals and so forth, they'll do that. Is that something that's on the horizon?
Very quick response,
We are
please.
certainly looking to expand our network of mobile advisors.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And that takes us to the end of this panel. I want to thank all of you for joining us and contributing to our study on C81. We're going to suspend just very, very briefly to bring in the next panel. Again, thank you very much. Suspend. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to our second panel for today. I'm not going to go through the whole preamble from earlier with regard to the accommodations that are being made. I will just remind everybody that there is both French and English sign language that is going on, and as a result, as a request from them, please keep your comments at a fairly metered pace. If you are going too fast, I will interrupt you, so I apologize in advance. But we just want to make sure that everyone is heard appropriately through all the different accessible means. Joining us here in our second panel from Accessible Media Incorporated, David Arrington, President and Chief Executive Officer. Welcome this morning. From Arch Disability Law Center, we have Robert Latanzio, Executive Director, and Carrie Joff, Staff Lawyer. Welcome to both of you. From the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, we have Scott Shortliff, Chief Consumer Officer and Executive Director. And joining him, we have Mary Louise Hayward, Manager, Social and Consumer Policy, and Adam Balkovec, Legal Counsel. Welcome to you. And starting us off this morning with opening remarks, please keep the remarks to about 5 minutes. But I will, again, keep a steady pace, and don't worry too much about going over a little bit. But first up, we have from Accessible Media Incorporated, Mr. David Arrington, President and Chief Executive Officer. The next 5 minutes are all yours, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is David Arrington, and I'm the President and CEO of Accessible Media Inc., or AMI. Thank you for inviting me to appear before you today. AMI commends the government of Ontario Canada's first federal legislation aiming at improving accessibility for people with disabilities. The objective of the proposed Accessible Canada Act, namely to enhance the full and equal participation of persons with disabilities in society, is very much in keeping with AMI's mandate. AMI is a media company that entertains, informs, and empowers Canadians who are blind and partially sighted. AMI's mandate is to establish and support a voice for Canadians with disabilities, representing their interests, concerns, and values through accessible media, reflection, and portrayal. AMI is currently licensed by the CRTC to operate 3 television services: AMI Audio, AMI TV, and AMI Tele. All 3 services have been deemed by the CRTC to be of exceptional importance to obtaining the objectives in Section 3(1)(p) of the Broadcasting Act, which provides that programming accessible by disabled persons should be provided within the Canadian broadcasting system as resources become available for the purpose. As a result, all three services have been granted mandatory carriage status as part of the basic television service by the CRTC. AMI Audio is Canada's only English language television audio reading service. It offers a variety of compelling stories and engaging original content to Canadians who are blind, partially sighted, or otherwise print restricted. AMI Audio's mandate is to deliver a steady and timely flow of information that is essential to the decision-making needs of our audience. AMI TV and its French language counterpart, AMI Tele, are television services that provide blind, partially sighted, deaf, and hard of hearing Canadians with access to open format described video and closed caption versions of popular programming, as well as original first-run content in a manner that is inclusive for all. For those unfamiliar with the term described video, or DV, is a narrated description of a program's main visual elements, such as settings, costumes, and body language. Description is added during pauses in dialogue and enables blind and partially sighted individuals to form a mental picture of what's happening in the program. While DV typically uses a separate audio track, AMI has pioneered the use of integrated described video, or IDV, whereby the identification of key individual elements is incorporated into the pre-production, production, and post-production phases of original programs. In addition, all the programming on AMI TV and AMI Tele is provided in open format described video with closed captioning. No special equipment or extra steps are required to access any of our television services, making them truly accessible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All 3 of our television services are the first of their kind in the world. These 3 services, along with our companion websites, mobile app, online media player, YouTube channel, and social media presence, provide blind, partially sighted, and deaf and hard of hearing Canadians with access to entertainment, news, and information programming that they would not otherwise be able to enjoy on platforms of their choice. However, AMI is more than just a broadcaster. In order to address the evolving needs and expectations of the blind and partially sighted Canadians and to changes within the audiovisual environment, AMI is evolved into a multifaceted company that creates, advocates, collaborates, and innovates in order to enable accessibility to all media. Create. Our television service focus on creating commission original, first-run Canadian program that directly addresses issues of importance to blind, partially sighted, and disabled communities. Without AMI's provision of this type of programming, these stories would not otherwise be told. These programs all provide positive on-air portrayal of blind and partially sighted individuals as hosts or subjects of the program, and feature themes and material of particular relevance to blind and partially sighted individuals. As a result, AMI has become a springboard for talent in the blind and partially sighted community, with approximately 78% of our on-air personalities being persons with a disability. Advocate. AMI has become a leader in advocating on behalf of the blind and partially sighted community to domestic and foreign regulatory bodies, such as the CRTC and the Disability Advisory Committee of the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. In addition, we provide opportunities for blind and partially sighted and disabled individuals to participate more fully in social, political, and cultural life. For example, we host an accessible federal elections town hall for the 2015 federal election, which encouraged blind and partially sighted individuals to cast their ballots and participate in a key aspect of our democracy. Collaborate. We collaborate with numerous organizations, including the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, the Federal Communications Commission, and most recently, the World Wide Web Consortium, to ensure that Canada's accessibility agenda is advanced both domestically and internationally. We partner with other broadcasters and local colleges to teach integrated described video techniques in the hopes that future generations of producers will regard accessibility as a fundamental component of production rather than a post-production afterthought. Innovate. Through our innovation, we try to ensure that scientific and technological advancements in accessibility are extended to blind and partially sighted communities. Our innovative and pioneering use of integrated described video has resulted in multiple awards. Together with the Canadian Association of Broadcasters and other organizations, we have created an award-winning online described video TV guide. We launched the first accessible online media player for broadcast in North America, and starting with our breakthrough of live descriptions of Toronto Blue Jays baseball games, we have described the live events that were previously thought to be unsuitable for described video, opening a whole new world of possibility and enjoyment for our viewers. We're also actively involved in developing and improving DV awareness and standards, both within the Canadian broadcasting system and on the international scale. Together with the Canadian Association of Broadcasters and other organizations, we have created best practice guides for DV and IDV production in both official languages. In 2017, we were awarded the FCC Chairman's Award for Advancement Accessibility for Integrated Described Video Best Practice Guide. AMI was one of only 4 winners of this award, 2 of which were Facebook and Amazon. These innovations enable AMI and other broadcasters to improve the quality of their described video productions and make them readily available to blind and partially sighted viewers. As evidence from these examples, AMI's mandate is more than just accessibility, but about representation, reflection, and positive portrayal of blind and partially sighted Canadians. However, there's still more work to be done. The needs and expectations of the blind and partially sighted community with respect to media accessibility are undergoing the same profound shift as experienced in broader Canadian broadcasting system. Like everyone else, these viewers are in search of high-quality content that directly speaks to their needs and interests and is readily available on a variety of platforms. According to the CNIB, approximately 500,000 Canadians are estimated to be living with significant vision loss that impacts their quality of life, and every year more than 50,000 Canadians will lose their sight. Moreover, CNIB predicts that the prevalence of vision loss in Canada is expected to increase nearly 30% in the next decade. This is due to the demographic shift caused by the aging population, with the population of Canadians aged 65 and older to expect to double in the next 25 years. In addition, there's growing incidence of key underlying causes of vision loss, such as obesity and diabetes. The CNIB warns that without action, the number of people with sight problems in Canada is likely to increase dramatically.
Excuse me, Mr. You're actually at about 7.5 minutes. I'm wondering if you can just conclude quickly, and then if there's things we can maybe deal with in questions.
Sure.
Sorry.
No problem. Can I just conclude then?
Conclude quickly, yep.
All right. I'll just do the final part. We are pleased that the CRTC has prioritized certain of these accessibility measures in the recent policy decisions. The CRTC has implemented a tiered approach to ramp up the amount of DV programming being provided by television broadcasters based on the size and resources of the broadcaster. The CRTC has required certain television distributors to include in their annual returns certain information relating to the availability of set-top boxes, the penetration of set-top boxes, and the number of accessibility-related queries they've received. These measures are consistent with the perhaps even overlap with some of the reporting requirements contained in Bill C-81. However, there's sufficient, sorry. The one thing we need to do is, given the limited financial means of many blind and partially sighted individuals and the lifeline that television media provides to these individuals, we believe the Government of Canada should ensure that accessible set-top boxes and remote controls are available for free or at a substantially discounted rate to the blind and partially sighted individuals. Until accessible set-top boxes and remote controls become ubiquitous, there will continue to be a barrier to television program for blind and partially sighted Canadians. Appreciate the opportunity to present AMI's views on this important matter. We'll be pleased to respond to any questions you may have. And sorry for being long.
Okay, thank you. Up next, from Arch Disability Law Center, Robert Latanzio, Executive Director, and Carrie Joff, Staff Lawyer. Welcome to both of you. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to this committee for this opportunity to speak with you this morning. Arch Disability Law Center is a specialty legal clinic focused solely on disability rights. We work on the ground with communities of persons with disabilities and with disability organizations, and within all levels of courts and tribunals in test case litigation. We commend the government and the minister for introducing Bill C-81, an important and positive step towards advancing full inclusion for persons with disabilities. We believe that amendments are needed for this bill to achieve its stated purpose. Today, we highlight 4 recommendations. First, we would like to address exemptions. This committee has heard from government that exemptions are needed to ensure innovation and flexibility for small organizations and those who exceed accessibility standards. We do not agree that the broad exemption powers currently in the bill are necessary to achieve these policy objectives. The bill must send a strong message that accessibility is everyone's responsibility. Therefore, as a general matter, regulated entities must not be exempt from complying with accessibility requirements. If exemption provisions do remain in the bill, we recommend safeguards, including 1, exemptions should be granted only in the narrowest of circumstances. 2, that reasons for the exemption be made public and that the public is afforded opportunities to provide feedback. And 3, any exemptions are subject to periodic review and removed if and when no longer necessary. Second recommendation today, as the committee is aware, is that the bill lacks timelines. Arch shares the concerns of disability communities. Timelines are essential for ensuring that the bill will advance accessibility in Canada for measuring progress towards this goal. We support recommendations that Section 5 include a timeline for achieving a Canada without barriers. We support recommendations that the bill include timelines by which accessibility standards are developed and enacted into law. Regarding timelines, progressive realization is an important international law concept which can provide a framework for ongoing implementation and monitoring of accessibility requirements. Arch recommends the minister and regulated entities establish 1, benchmarks for progressively realizing a Canada without barriers in all the designated areas. 2, specific and progressive timelines for meeting these benchmarks. And 3, to monitor progress towards meeting these benchmarks. We also recommend that independent reviews of the Act be held to coincide with Canada's reporting obligations under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We recommend that the first independent review of the Act be held in 2025 to coincide with Canada's 3rd report to the UN CRPD Committee and every 4 years thereafter. Third, we need amendments to ensure that accessibility requirements do not diminish existing legal rights of persons with disabilities. The Canadian Human Rights Act and the Charter provide vitally important protections from discrimination for people with disabilities. Disability communities fought hard for these protections. We are concerned that regulated entities may believe that compliance with accessibility requirements is the same as fulfilling their obligation to accommodate and not discriminate. This would be a troubling unintended consequence of Bill C-81. The bill must work together with the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Charter. Therefore, we recommend that the preamble and purpose sections of Bill C-81 clarify that nothing in the Act lessens existing human rights obligations of federally regulated entities under the Canadian Human Rights Act, and that where a conflict arises between the Accessible Canada Act and another law, the law that provides the greatest accessibility for persons with disabilities will apply. Fourth, Bill C-81 does not designate one central agency to oversee compliance of accessibility requirements and adjudicate complaints. Rather, it creates an overly complex system of multiple agencies. This will create confusion and additional unnecessary barriers to access to justice for persons with disabilities. We heard this concern consistently throughout the consultations that we conducted. Multiple bodies adjudicating accessibility complaints will likely result in uneven or unfair enforcement, delay, and inefficiency. Following a legal analysis of CTA decisions and our experience, we are concerned that the CTA may be more likely to treat human rights and accessibility as secondary to technical concerns, resulting in weak enforcement of accessibility requirements in transportation. We heard similar concerns from the community about the CRTC. To avoid these problems, the Accessibility Commissioner should receive all complaints about violation of accessibility standards. The no wrong door policy is inadequate to address our concerns. Our materials include recommendations in relation to the rights of Indigenous persons with disabilities, intersectionality, recognition of sign languages, among other important issues. Thank you, and we would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. And up next, from the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, we are joined by Scott Shortliff, Chief Consumer Officer and Executive Director, as well as Mary Lou Hayward, Manager, Social and Consumer Policy, and Adam Balkovic, Legal Counsel. Thank you to all three of you, and 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity to participate in the committee's review of Bill C-81, an act to ensure a barrier-free Canada. I'd like to begin today by doing two things, acknowledging that we meet on traditional Algonquin territory, and if you'll permit me. L'approche de CRTC en matière
The CRTC's approach to accessibility is based upon the fundamental belief that a person's ability to access broadcast and telecommunications services dictates their ability to participate meaningfully in society. Our accessibility policy is grounded in the principle that equality is a core Canadian value and is central to the public interest.
The CRTC has adopted a series of regulatory policies to enhance the ability of Canadians with disabilities to access communications networks. We have updated these policies as new technologies and resources become available. The CRTC a toujours défendu.
The CRTC has continually championed accessibility and has required service providers to deploy appropriate technologies to improve access for all Canadians, regardless of their level of ability.
For example, the CRTC began to mandate teletypewriter or TTY relay service for Canadians who have a hearing or speech disability. In 2009, the requirement was expanded to include the provision of IP relay services, and 5 years later, the provision of video relay services. Accessibility requirements for broadcasters have followed a similar evolution. Initially, broadcasters were required to close caption only a percentage of programming. Today, all pre-recorded English and French programming must be closed captioned. 2009, the CRTC began to require that broadcasters provide described video services 4 hours per week. Beginning next year, all large integrated broadcasters must provide the services throughout prime time. Le travail de CRTC dont
The CRTC's work in the domain of accessibility also includes regulatory measures designed to facilitate access to the devices Canadians use to access communications services, whether it is accessible set-top boxes, remote controls, or wireless mobile handsets. The CRTC also recognizes the importance of facilitating interactions with service providers. This is why we established mandatory industry codes of conduct, the Wireless Code and the Television Service Provider Code. These codes ensure that persons with disabilities can receive contracts and bills in accessible formats and can access extended trial periods to ensure that equipment and services will meet their individual needs. To develop regulatory policies, the CRTC consults with Canadians, including those with disabilities, along with service providers and other stakeholders, by holding open public proceedings. The input of Canadians with disabilities is crucial to developing effective and impactful accessibility policies. It's also why the CRTC website presents key content, such as a guide to our rules of procedure in ASL, American Sign Language, and LSQ, Langue des Signes Québécoise.
Free access, the CRTC recognizes that it must engage with other administrative tribunals. To this end, the CRTC participates in working groups alongside the Canadian Human Rights Commission and other administrative tribunals in order to leverage accessibility expertise and to increase efficiency. As a federal regulatory tribunal, the CRTC must pursue the policy goals set by the Broadcasting Act and the Telecommunications Act, while also acting fairly and abiding by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This requires the CRTC to balance competing objectives in rendering decisions that ultimately serve the public interest. As communication technologies evolve, Canada's regulatory framework must be flexible and rigorous, enough to make the most of new opportunities and to eliminate and prevent systemic barriers related to accessibility. Advances in communications technologies have opened the door to an unprecedented wealth of content and interactivity. The CRTC's position is that it's the right of all Canadians to be able to access this wealth regardless of their ability, and is committed to working to ensure that all Canadians can benefit from it. Comme je l'ai mentionné, l'approche de CRTC.
As I mentioned, the CRTC's approach is informed by Canadian human rights principles, and these will continue to guide our regulatory work.
That the CRTC is an independent regulator, and I note that this panel includes a party regulated by the CRTC. As such, and to preserve the Commission's independence as regulator, I may be unable to comment on certain issues raised or to fully answer certain questions. But that said, I will do my best to answer any questions this committee may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And up first, we have MP Falk for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here today. The committee really appreciates it because we are hearing different things, and I know earlier today, my colleagues just across the way had mentioned about they're going to be pushing for no timelines or alluded to that. So my question is going to be for Arch, so Mr. Latazino and Ms. Joff. So you had mentioned in your opening remarks about timelines and the importance of timelines and benchmarks. Do you have suggestions of what those timelines or benchmarks should be?
Thank you for that question. We have some examples. I would just like to start, if I can, talk a little bit more about, flowing from what came in the earlier session about progressive realization, that we understand it to be much more rigorous than was discussed at that previous session. So when we think about examples of timelines, we're really thinking about how we break down the various pieces. As complex as this piece of legislation is, we're really thinking about creating a structure where we can start parceling off and achieving certain benchmarks. So some examples would be just around the standard development process, for example. So having some timelines, some measurements, some benchmarks there. When regulated entities develop and implement their accessibility plans, for example. I think those are just a few examples, but we can really break that down and identify various. Yeah.
Well, even having the accessibility commissioner and even CASDO established. I mean, timelines with that, right? Just because the way the legislation sits right now, once this receives royal assent, what happens?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, and as my colleague stated, we certainly support the calls from the other disability organizations who have appeared before the committee that, of course, there should be timelines, attached to Section 5 of the bill for bringing in the regulations, the standards, for CASDO being set up for the standard development process. I think what we've been trying to emphasize as well, as in addition to those standards, which are crucial for ensuring that we can monitor progress towards meeting accessibility requirements, we also need to insert benchmarks and some kind of timeline process within the development of the standard process, and in order to ensure that we do reach markers for progressive realization of the standards and the ongoing work towards improving meeting of the standards.
So do you think that by having some type of timelines or benchmarks, doing this piece by piece, really step by step, would be would achieve the balance? Because the trend that I'm seeing is hearing from people within the disability community, they expect timelines to be in this. And a lot of the organizations I've met with said this should have been dealt with yesterday, not today, just as a whole, right? So I understand that, we're moving forward, things are evolving, things change over time. I understand that. But I'm just concerned with, if this legislation has no timelines, no benchmarks, what type of message would that send to people in the disability community?
Well, I would be concerned about that message, and I think overall the concern is that, as you mentioned, as of day one when this bill receives royal assent, there really isn't anything required. I think in addressing the concern about the evolution or the progression of technology, for example, or how we understand and how disability evolves, our response to that would just be that, well, standards would have to be updated as we go, and that would fit within whatever timeline, is set out. So there are ways of dealing with that kind of progression and change.
Perfect, thank you. One other question regarding complaints. So we know that, and I believe you touched on this. So we have the 4 administrative bodies that would be responsible for dealing with accessibility-related complaints. So that would include the Accessibility Commissioner, CRTC, Canadian Transport Agency, and the Federal Public Sector Labor Relations. So I'm just wondering what would happen, theoretically, hypothetically, if an individual were to bring a complaint to the wrong administrative body. So, for example, if somebody brought a complaint to the Accessibility Commissioner when it should have instead been filed with the Canadian Transport Agency.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. I don't think that we know right now what would happen in the absence of regulations, and having some experience with how the process would roll out within the various agencies. What I will say is that in doing our analysis of the bill and coming up with recommendations, we consulted with our members, with disability communities, and with a number of the other groupings of disability organizations who have appeared before the committee and will appear before the committee later this week. And we heard very consistently across all those consultations that there's great concern within the community about having these various agencies deal with complaints, and about the additional access to justice barriers that would create for people with disabilities who already experience a number of barriers to accessing justice and accessing extremely complicated service delivery systems and programming systems. So people are very concerned about that. From a legal point of view, we are concerned about the ability of the other bodies who have been charged with addressing these complaints to apply a really robust human rights analysis, which has a full understanding of disability, accessibility, and human rights. And we would like to see those. We've made a number of recommendations in our other materials for ensuring that either complaints all go to the Accessibility Commissioner as a body that we would anticipate does have that deep understanding of human rights and can do justice to those kinds of complaints, or if if the complaints are going to be continue to be happening across multiple agencies, that those agencies have obligations in the legislation to apply a much more robust human rights analysis than they currently do.
Thank you very much. Thank you. MP Morrissey, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Arch. And an earlier witness made the statement that no time will Canada be barrier-free, which then leads to the question, and we've heard from a number of stakeholders that there is no deadline to make Canada fully accessible. Should the goal be to always strive to achieve a more accessible Canada or to achieve a static accessibility goal? I'd be interested in your observation.
Maybe I'll begin. And so I don't think that having timelines means that we are taking the position that we are accepting a static accessibility goal. We think about timelines just as a way to move us forward into whatever evolution. I think we also need to remember that this bill is not going to do it all. This isn't the one law that will make inclusion real for people with disabilities. This isn't the law that will make full citizenship real. This is one important piece. This is one piece. And we need to understand that we have a lot of different layers. We have an incredibly aspirational convention that we've ratified. We have, of course, the Charter. We have the Canadian Human Rights Act. And I think this committee has heard a lot about how those type of laws, like the Canadian Human Rights Act, is a piece of legislation that is reactionary, and that this law, or this bill rather, is proactive. And I just want to challenge that a little bit, because I think that in order for us to really understand where this bill fits into the larger landscape, I think we need to acknowledge that the human rights legislation is actually not only reactionary. There are a lot of things from a rights perspective that really strive for government, for private sector to push for accessibility through a non-discrimination lens. And when you think about that with the Charter, and then you add this piece, you start to really understand the importance for some of the recommendations that we're making around ensuring that one piece of law doesn't impact the other, but rather complements the other. I hope that answers your question.
It spoke to the global issue, but it didn't get back to what the target should be to achieve a more accessible Canada or to achieve a static accessibility goal. I have a question as well to Arch. This legislation that was referenced a number of times takes on an access approach versus an anti-discriminatory route. Could you comment?
Sure. And I guess
jurisdictions have used an anti-discriminatory route versus the focus on access.
Right. And again, if we think about how these different laws operate, we have a more individually driven system through anti-discrimination, where you have a complainant identifying an issue of discrimination and bringing it forward through a process. So it's somewhat piecemeal. It's embedded within the facts of that scenario, within the facts of that complaint. And the attempt here is that we are thinking about it more globally. We are thinking about a level of minimum standards. I don't want to treat them as different. I think they need to really work together for this to really work. When we think about how we work through human rights complaints, we think a lot about, obviously we deal with the facts before us, but we think about the systemic implementation of some of the remedies. So we think about the impact. Sometimes we deal with issues that this act may very well deal with. So there are a lot of those commonalities. So again, I fear to draw clear distinctions between the two. There is overlap. There is a real need to make sure that they work together.
Did your group participate in the consultation process?
We did.
Yeah.
Yes,
Did you comment on the question or the situation that I just posed to you in that consultation process?
We did during the consultation process. We made some comments and provided some information around sort of trying to think about this legislation not only as legislation focused on accessibility, but really focused on rights for persons with disabilities and thinking about persons with disabilities as rights holders and CRPD implementation kind of legislation. And we wrote a couple of papers in the pre-bill consultation period, which tried to think about and put forward some recommendations around how this legislation could really implement a number of rights that are in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and implement those much more fully into Canadian domestic law. So I'm happy to, we can provide those to you if that would be of interest after today. But yeah, we definitely, I think when C81 was getting going, we were thinking of this legislation much more as rights conferring legislation rather than with just focusing only on accessibility.
Thank you very much. And MP Hardcastle, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the testimony and for pointing out the importance of progressive realization in having timelines. I think what I'd like to ask in general, but obviously I think Arch will probably have the first comments to make on this. I wanted to ask with regards to C81 now, the largest organization that will have to obey this legislation is the federal government. So I want to ask about independence from the government. Under the bill right now, there could be some perceived weakness in independence. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you for the question. Certainly, we would agree that independence is crucial for a number of the key components of this bill, and is crucial, especially for CASDO, to ensure that the proposed accessibility standards that come out of CASDO are as robust and progressive as they can possibly be, and really address the needs of a cross-section of persons with disabilities, without being encumbered by the government of the day or the particular politics of the day. So that's certainly an area where we have made some recommendations for enhancing independence. We've also made some recommendations around independence in relation to some of the other key accessibility components in the bill, and we're happy to provide those to the committee. Those are contained in our written submission to the committee.
Anybody else want to talk about independence and where these should report to?
Well, from the CRTC's perspective, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I mean, in terms of legislation, we will, of course, implement whatever legislation is passed. We're not going to take a view on whether it should be with us or not. But in terms of independence, the CRTC has always zealously guarded its independence, and numerous governments of the day could testify that they haven't always been delighted with CRTC decisions. One approach we have here is we are working with the other agencies to say that we've seen the thrust of the bill, we will implement what it's passed, but for example, we're forming working groups to make sure that there's a one front door approach, so that if a complaint comes in, if it's misdirected, if something came into CRTC that belonged to the transportation agency, we won't simply send them on their way. We'll process it the moment it comes in. I think as independent tribunals, we can maintain our independence from the government, but that doesn't mean that we can't also work together efficiently and effectively to make sure that the intent of this bill is always respected. So I certainly believe that we have shown in the past that we can be independent. I also believe that that means that we can work together for the benefit of persons with disabilities.
Thank you. Are we, so let's go back to the concern, just because we heard from Mr. Shortliff about exemptions. Big concern that there are exemptions and no, without any reason having to be given. We talk about this bill moving us into an era, a culture change of human rights for persons living with disabilities, and there's no appeal process. So maybe let's talk about, if worst case scenario, the exemptions stay for these federal jurisdictions, but can we flesh out the idea of a reporting, an appeal mechanism, a rationale for it?
If I can address that, it's important to remember from the perspective of the CRTC, we have our already established procedures. There's nothing that goes to the CRTC that isn't based on a public record, public hearing, comment, which includes comments by disability group. And then once we make decisions, those decisions can actually be appealed. They can be appealed in telecom to cabinet for review and variance. They can be appealed to, in the broadcasting side, to be referred back. They can be appealed to federal court. In the issues that have been raised, the CRTC operates on the public record and on the basis of public testimony. We do not issue exemptions that are issued by a star chamber with no public record and with
Absolutely, and that's all public knowledge, that the track record of the CRTC. So we'll give the last little bit then to Arch.
Sure. So we addressed this in our opening remarks, but I think our recommendation has been no exemptions, and the reason, I guess policy reason for that is, as Mr. Latanzio said, accessibility is everyone's responsibility, and no one should be exempt from moving towards a more inclusive and accessible Canada. If the exemption, as you asked, if the exemptions do stay, we've made some recommendations for really tailoring those exemptions much more specifically to the particular requirements of the organization that is asking for an exemption. So we would say that those exemptions should be granted only in the very narrowest of circumstances. They should be time limited. There should be a review process in place so that as the organization works towards meeting its accessibility requirements, if and when that exemption can be lifted, it is lifted. And before the decision is made to grant that exemption, there should be a process where persons with disabilities can engage and provide their input and perspective about whether that exemption is actually required and what the impact of that will be on the community.
Thank you very much. Thank you. MP Sangha, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for coming today and making your presentations. It's really very educative. So I'm from Brampton Centre. I have got my people, those who I generally sit with them, talk to them, and do some consultations regarding the things which I'm coming to the committee and asking the questions and doing the study. So I have the chance to talk to Ms. Bance. Ms. Bance, she's a accessibility professional certification she has got, and she is expert in digital accessibility, advisor, team management to create inclusive, accessible online services. Being expert in this, she says that she has got no grudge. She has got good facilities which are being provided through Accessibility Ontario Disability Act. And things are favorable, but sometimes she says we get disappointment. So that is sometimes a complaint process which is these people, disabled people, have to go through. She says we have to hire our own lawyer, and other side organizations have their firms and big lawyers, and we get very big problems to get the favorable, suitable results from the tribunals. So being a lawyer, I have also that concern. So Ms. Carrie Jove, my question is to you. So being a house lawyer, so what do you think this proposition, how you fit this one, what is your reply to that, how you tackle these complaints?
How do I address the issue about people with
the complaints by the accessible person?
Yeah, that people with disabilities are, we experience that every day in our clinic, that people with disabilities are very, very disempowered in many complaint processes because, as you said, the respondents or the organizations who are being complained about have usually a lot more resources, and they have lawyers, they have in-house counsel, and they can, bring a lot of resources to bear in defending themselves. I think, and I think the way that we've seen or what we've sort of analyzed when we're looking at the bill and how this bill sets up a complaint mechanism to the Accessibility Commissioner and to other bodies, but specifically to the Accessibility Commissioner, it appears to us that that process is intended to be relatively quick, non-legalistic, and trying to sort of provide a remedy or a result in a manner that doesn't create these sort of power imbalances where the other side has a lot of lawyers and the person with a disability is really at a disadvantage. So I think if we can work to get a complaint process that does create that a bit more of a power balance, and that can really support people with disabilities to meaningfully participate in that process, and for that process to be really accessible, then hopefully it would have a chance of avoiding some of those concerns that you've raised.
So, taking into comparison regarding Canadian Human Rights Commission Tribunal and the new setup which will be now under this Act C81, so you think that the process under the C81 will be better favorable to the complainants, or it's going to be more tedious?
Yeah, it's very difficult to say because we don't know what that process looks like right now. So I'm not really able to answer whether it's going to be more favorable to people or not. I think what will determine whether it's going to be more favorable is how accessible the process actually is, how much it allows people with disabilities to meaningfully understand and participate in the process, and also what kind of results or remedies we get, and how well trained the decision makers are, how deeply they understand human rights and accessibility issues.
Some dispute resolution process in this one? Is there already dispute resolution process in existence?
Very quickly,
HRCA?
please. Very quickly, please.
Sorry, is there a dispute?
Is there dispute resolution process already in existence to resolve the complaints?
Well, I think some of the issues that people with disabilities will complain about to the Accessibility Commissioner may also overlap or, may also be able to be brought to the Canadian Human Rights Commission under their legislation, the Canadian Human Rights Act.
Thank you very much. MP Long, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is for Arch. Mr. Lantenzio, sorry. I want to talk about the no wrong door part of the legislation. Obviously that if you go to a department, you don't just get bumped to another department. There's onus on the department. Would you not agree that that's a step in the right direction?
Well, it's certainly better than if that's going to be the system, then we want to make sure that the complaint lands where it needs to land. But I think the real issue is when you have an overly complex system, it's best just to remedy that system as opposed to just create Band-Aid solutions. As we discussed earlier, we have already incredibly complex various tribunal processes that persons with disabilities really struggle through. There is a lack of legal representation. There is a lack of legal aid that covers a lot of these areas, like human rights, for example. So, I think it's really difficult for us to say that that's a solution. I think we also might think about, from an accessibility perspective and an access to justice perspective, what that means, that if someone could make a complaint to a body and then it's up to that body, it's up to a bureaucratic decision about where that complaint goes, I think we would have some very serious concerns around the lack of control, the lack of the disempowerment that plays on the complainant. So again, I think it also falls into, if we had a system here where we had assurances of legal support, for example, I think my answer might be a little bit different. Probably not, but there are no supports here in place.
Thank you for that. I also want to get your opinion on the CASDO board and diversity on the board and 23.2. And, is there a way to amend that potentially that allows for more diversity on the board in the disability community?
Right, and certainly we would suggest, as do our colleagues in the disability communities, that we would want as much representation as possible, given the diversity, given intersectionality, multiple disabilities. I want to make a point, though, that I haven't heard yet, and that's we talk a lot about the makeup of the CASDO board, but we haven't really talked about the makeup of the committees that are actually doing a lot of that work in standard development. And I think we have a concern that there really hasn't been a lot of attention in ensuring representation in those committees.
Thank you.
You got about a minute left? No? You're good?
Yeah, well, if we've got a minute, does anyone else want to comment on the makeup of the CASDO board and, how they feel? Should each disability community be represented as best possible? Should it be 50+1, 70%, or those that say 100%? Mr. Sherman?
I think, unfortunately, because as a regulatory body, we try to avoid commenting on what the government's decisions on the compositions of boards and other regulatory bodies. Certainly, we believe that there should be strong representation, but we don't have a specific formula that we would advise. I would just say that in our case, when we're doing consultations, we consult regularly with groups, whether the national like CNIB or the Neil Squire Society or Alliance for Deaf Canadians, Alberta. We see that having different points of view represented is key because, as with any Canadians, disabled Canadians have a variety of different views. It's not a monolith. And the greater diversity you have, the more informed your decisions will be. But having said that, we have no specific formula to propose.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last word. Not only are we coming up to our time, but we can see that the bells are ringing for votes. I just want to remind committee members of the next few meetings. There are some unique times associated to them. So on October 24th, we are going to be meeting tomorrow evening at 6:45 to 8:45 p.m. And then on the 25th, we will be here very early at 8 a.m. So late night, early morning. And I just wanted to thank the witnesses for being here today to contribute to our study on C81 as well. Thank you to my colleagues and all the people that make today possible. Thank you very much. Adjourned.
you.